course, we're going to look at the mitzvah of lo tachmod, do not covet, which is the 10th commandment in most countings of the 10 commandments. And of course, you see in the top of the source sheet, this is mitzvah number 38. There's a parallel mitzvah number 416, which uses the word do not desire. And so we'll try to touch upon both of those mitzvot and see how they are similar and how they are different. The first question one could ask is on this mitzvah, do not covet. It seems that this is a thought mitzvah. And in fact, some people suggest this is basically one mitzvah that has to do with thinking, after we've just had 4 mitzvot connected to actual physical actions. And it's parallel in a sense to the first side of the 10 commandments, where you have also a thought mitzvah, I'm the Lord your God, meaning belief in God, and then 4 mitzvot that have to do with actual actions. The question, of course, one can ask then is, what does it mean that the Torah commands us on thought, or on belief, or on feelings? It's the same question you could ask about loving the Lord your God, or belief in God, or loving your neighbor, meaning you can't command love. You can't command belief. You either have it or you don't, but it doesn't seem possible to command it. Now, of course, we've spoken about the idea before of commanding belief, what that really means, and there's different ways of answering that question, there were different ways we looked at it. It could actually be that there's an action involved that we don't really think about, or that there's a way of commanding thought and the like. And we'll look at both of those type of answers as we look at this mitzvah as well. The one thing I would just sort of preface, there is one individual who argues that this is an action. Do not covet. He argues, his name is, he's a biblical scholar in America, Joel Hoffman. He argues that the word lachmod is not covet, not desire, but is a mistranslation that actually means take. Do not take. That's how he says we're really actually supposed to read this. Do not take your neighbor's wife. Do not take the ox. Do not take other people's items. And that, of course, would solve a lot of our problems. And he has different argumentation why it is. He says a lot of our translations, in general, make mistakes because of the different time periods we live in. So, for example, we spoke a few weeks ago about how in Isaiah, when you have the mitzvah, when you have the pasuk that speaks about a young maiden who gives birth, who will give birth to someone named Emmanuel. Christians, based upon the Greek translation, feel that it's a virgin who gives birth to a child. Because in those days, most virgins were young women, and most young women were virgins. And so when the translation was in the Greek, it was missed. And as a result, you were led astray in that direction. There's other examples like that as well, where we don't understand the context fully. For example, in biblical times, a shepherd. A shepherd we think of as sort of very peaceful, has this flute, very flowing clothes, especially today. And he goes out and he sort of sleeps and he doesn't do much. But in biblical times, a shepherd was actually a very fierce individual. I mean, we have stories of David fighting a bear, fighting a lion. To be by yourself in the woods was a very powerful and almost stoic royal profession. And so if you read, for example, Psalm 33, when he says, the Lord is my shepherd, today we understand it in one direction. The Lord is my shepherd is very peaceful and God's watching over us. But if you understand it in the biblical context, it has a much stronger meaning. Right? The Lord is my fierce defender, something along those lines. You have mistranslations also, for example, Jubilee, right? The Jubilee year. What's that translated from? What's the Hebrew? Yovel, right? This is the Shnat Yovel. So, technically speaking, a Yovel is the horn on a certain type of, sheep or goat. And the Shnat Yovel is because that's the year you would blow the shofar, coming from that horn. In the Latin, Yovel sounds very similar to the Latin word for jubilee, jubilation. So we call it, in English, the Jubilee year, the year of jubilation, but it's a mistranslation, again, because we're not knowing the exact Hebrew. So he argues we make a lot of mistakes all the time in terms of translation, and so therefore we have to be careful. And the original word, he thinks, means do not take. He has one, I think, strong proof, The rest of his proofs are actually fairly weak. He says, for example, in Shmot, when the Jews will do the Shlosh Regalim, the Torah says, when you leave your home and you go up to Yerushalayim for the Shlosh Regalim, do not fear that other people surrounding you will lachmod your land, that they will covet your land. The way I think the tradition understands this verse is that when all of Am Yisrael goes up and fulfills the mitzvah of appearing in Yerushalayim, we will be a strong people, and we don't have to be fearful that nations surrounding us will have designs on our land. He understands it is when that individual farmer leaves his land, one of the things he might be fearful of, if I come to Jerusalem for a week, then someone else will take my land. And so he says they wouldn't be fearful of someone coveting my land. They would only be fearful of someone physically taking my land. So that's his argument, and that solves some of our problems. Do not covet is do not take. The problem with it, as I said, is there aren't really, when I look through all the etymology and things like that, there's really no one else who says chet mem daled means take. Almost everyone says it means covet or have a strong desire or thing along those lines. And the second problem, of course, is if it is take, what does this mitzvah really mean? Meaning, why is this one of the 10 commandments? Because what do we just talk about? We just talk about not stealing and not bearing false witness. This one seems to be a parallel to not stealing, and it doesn't seem to be of the same level anyway. So the two questions we're going to be sort of looking at in the sources is, one, what does it mean if the Torah is commanding us about a thought? How can it command us? What really might be involved? And secondly, why is this mitzvah here? What's the significance of do not coveting? That it has to be. Remember, the other mitzvahs we spoke about were capital crimes, right? Do not murder, do not kidnap, the false witness that you might put someone to death. These are all capital crimes. Why should this be included in the 10 Commandments? So towards that end, let's start with looking at what the Sefer Chinuch has to say on this regard. And we'll see a few different answers to those two questions. Why do we include it? And what in terms of thought? Can you control thought? Or maybe there might be an action involved, but not as explicit as do not take. So the Sefer Chinuch begins, do not covet, do not bring up to our thoughts to do a machination to take for yourselves that which is someone else's of our brothers. Already you get a little bit in the language. He says in the Hebrew, la'alot, do not bring up your thoughts. In other words, he suggests, I think if we read it carefully, that you have some control over your thoughts. There are some thoughts that you're allowed to bring up, and some that you're sometimes able to press. Yeah, you.
No, we don't.
You don't. You don't.
We have thousands, we have hundreds of thoughts
Yes.
a minute. But the point is, the Yetzer Hara, we need to told, our job is to provoke those thoughts.
Right, well, so you said two things that are very interesting. One is that we have hundreds and thousands of thoughts. It's true, we do have thousands and thousands of thoughts, but we don't actually bring all those up to our conscious every day. And what social scientists say is it's impossible to have every experience that you have during the course of the day actually register in your conscious. It's literally impossible. If you were looking at the clock constantly and someone walking in and the sound, it would be impossible. So you filter out a great deal of happenings that take place every single day. How do you know what to filter and what not to? It's not done consciously, it's done subconsciously. And what the social scientists say is very often you created a spam filter. What's a spam filter on your computer? Basically, you tell your computer, I don't want to see any emails from this, I don't want to see any emails from there. So the human being does the exact same thing. How do we say we don't want to see things and not even so it comes up to our thoughts? So partly by the actions we did yesterday. What we did yesterday influences what we're going to see today. So, for example, if you find yourself sitting in a Shir, right, you're not going to be exposed to, what takes place in Las Vegas or Times Square or something like that. You're not going to be exposed to that. And so therefore, those type of thoughts will not come up as much. So the decisions you make and where you place yourself very heavily influence the thoughts that do come up. So either you could say that I'm creating an environment that encourages certain types of thoughts and discourages other type of thoughts. If anyone is dieted, this is an incredibly important lesson, right? Because if you're sitting in front of the cake, it's very hard. You have to use your willpower to say, I don't want the cake. But if you never have the cake brought out to you, and you're never tested in the same way, right? It's much easier not to buy the item at the supermarket than to buy the item and then not eat it at home. And so similarly, you can create environments that you want so you're not challenged by those thoughts. So those two things. One is that we have to create a spam filter, and we create the spam filter by the actions we take. So we do have some control over the thoughts that are going to come up. The second idea that I think where you could do this is willpower itself, meaning sometimes when you're, for example, overcome with fear or nervousness, right? And someone will tell you, don't think about it, let it go. It doesn't work, right? My understanding, the number of times you tell someone to relax or calm down, I believe there is literally 0 people who have actually relaxed or calmed down as a result of giving that piece of advice. So it doesn't always help. But internally, I'm sure we've all been there in a situation where you do feel more nervous or you do feel more fearful and you don't want those feelings. And sometimes you just say, I'm going to shift my thoughts. It's not easy to do, and it's not always successful, but sometimes, right, we can fake it until we make it. This is the Sefer Chinuch on Mitzvah number 16, if you remember, when he talks about all the habits that one develops. You can control your habits, and that will influence your thoughts. You do have some control, and he's going to speak more about that as we get through it. If you recall just for a moment, when we spoke about Mitzvah number 16 and we spoke about habits, there's usually 3 elements of forming a habit. One is there's a cue, right? It's Tuesday, so Tuesday I always get up and I go to the supermarket. Or it's, I'm in this environment, and whenever I find myself in the, I'm turning to food again, whenever I find myself in this restaurant smelling this thing, I always order X. So there's the cue, then there's the routine, and then after the routine, there's the reward. And this is a loop, and it's very, very strong. The example I gave was actually of an individual who suffered from a disease, who lost his long-term memory, but he didn't lose his habit loop. And so therefore, this individual was in San Diego. The alarm clock would go off. He had formed a habit in previous years of his life where he would always get up and make breakfast. He would make breakfast, eggs, and he was not Jewish, bacon, and then he would go and sit in front of the TV, and this was his habit. And then he would doze off. So what happened, though, is he forgot memory, but he didn't forget habit. So the alarm clock would go off, he'd get up, make breakfast, come back, fall asleep in front of the TV, he'd hear the radio again, he thought he was waking up again, do the exact same thing, and had 5 or 6 breakfasts every day because of this habit loop. So we do have some control in that we may not be able to always suppress our thoughts. Sometimes we can, and there's a lot of people who try to teach us and help us in that regard. But there's techniques. You avoid the cue, right? If you know that this smell is going to set you off, or this interaction with a person, right? If you sometimes get very angry because you always find that it's the same person, the same conversation, you avoid the conversation. And then there's the routine. You could be in the same cue, but make sure you positively do some other experience for the routine, and along those lines. So he's going to, the Sefer Chinuch is the most adamant that we can control our thoughts, either through sheer willpower or through creating certain types of techniques. So he says, do not bring up to our thoughts to take for yourselves that which is someone else's your thought. You shall not covet the house of your neighbor, etc. And it's already proven, do not covet, and you shall not take for yourself. He's now moving to a slightly different argumentation, which maybe suggests that coveting is part of an action. What's the part of the action? Coveting is what leads to taking. This is quoting the Rambam. The negative commandment, you shall not covet, is not completed until he acts upon it. Right? Here's an action, a real action, meaning it's not what are you thinking or you're coveting. The action, the isur, only takes place when you covet and then you follow through on your action, and you actually take.
What you're saying is that coveting is in a process. First you think about it, and then you allow those thoughts to
Right.
take hold of your actions.
Correct.
So it becomes a process.
It's a process. And in fact, that's the whole reason, and we'll see this in just a moment, number 416, why most of the commentaries say there's two different words, do not desire and do not covet. There's some source sheets up here if you would like.
I'll pass them out.
Okay.
I'm also told, I'll tell them.
Okay.
Let me have the source sheets. Oh, there are 40. I think it's
Okay. So, it appears twice, right? The commandment appears twice, but two different words. So most of the commentaries say, picking up on your comment, which is that there's a process. What's the process? The first start of the process is do not desire. Do not, in a sense, the way most people understand is, do not make a plan to acquire someone else's property. Here too is an action, right? It's not a mental plan. It's not simply thinking or being jealous, but it's making a mental plan, and then do not covet is the second step of that mental plan, which is pursuing it, starting to put it into action, and then the third action, of course, is taking. So you're exactly right that this whole idea is that there's a process, and do not covet is an essential part of that process. It's following through on a mental plan of how you get from A to B. So there's two ways of seeing it as an action. One is that it's the first step in actually taking. I'm sorry. One is it's part of taking, right? Because you only violate the commandment when taking actually takes place. The other is to see it as part of a process, starting with do not desire, which leads to do not covet, which then leads to taking. The Rambam speaks, this whole mitzvah is a fence around the Torah. If you don't allow yourself to make a mental plan of how you're going to take someone else's property, so then you'll never actually take the property. We never start off right away with taking something from someone. You always think about it a little bit, you figure out how you would think about it, and that's a different type of thought. This is not against jealousy, per se. It's not about wanting something else. It's about wanting something very specific and thinking how you could go about getting that specific item. And that you can control. You can control that particular idea. Just before we move on, I want to do one sort of side point, which is not so much about do not coveting, but it's just an interesting halacha in general. You notice that the Sefer Chinuch says, you have not violated the mitzvah until you've taken the item. And then he says, even if you pay for the item, but you've pressured the person, you go to a person who has a brand new car and say, I really would like your car, I'm willing to pay fair value for it. He says, no, I'm not selling. And then you put pressure and you put a bunch of other people to call, and you do all these different pressures. That's also part of do not coveting, even if in the end you end up paying him. You violated a commandment, but the interesting thing is, in terms of Jewish contract law, you've also bought the car. Meaning even if there is coercion, Jewish law says that the sale still goes through. And you see an actual very extreme case of that in source number 2. It's not about coveting at all, but just that you might be interested in Jewish contract law, which is very different than Israeli law or American law for that matter. The story is told about Rav Huna. And Rav Huna says that if you sell an item and you receive fair market value for it, even if you're coerced, the sale still goes through. Listen, you could sue the person for coercing you, you could do a lot of other things, but the sale still goes through. He gives the example if you're being hung by a tree, and the person says, sell it to me, but I'm paying you for it. If you agree to it, nevertheless, it goes through. And some of the commentaries suggest the reason why is you're always under some type of duress when you have to sell. You need money, whatever the case may be. So we're not going to look at that particular item. Anyway, it's an interesting case in that regard. Okay, let's go to the second Sefer Chinuch, 416, which is on number 3, where he fleshes out a little bit more what he had said previously. Do not wonder to say, and how is it that the hand of man to prevent his heart from desiring the storehouse of every delightful vessel that he sees in his hand of the fellow, whereas he is totally empty of them? How does the Torah bring a prevention about that which is impossible for a man to uphold? This was our initial question. How can the Torah command us to control our thoughts? And then he goes on, and he's actually very dismissive of the idea that you can't control your thoughts. The thing is not like this, and only silly evildoers that sin with their soul say it. As truly it is in the hand of man to prevent himself and his thoughts and his desires from anything that he wants. You can control it. We spoke about perhaps by using techniques, or perhaps by suppressing inappropriate thoughts, perhaps by choosing the environment in which you want to be in. It is within his control and his cognizance to distance and to bring close his want for all things according to his will. And his heart is given into his hand to anything that he wants, and he can incline it. This statement by the Sefer Chinuch, I'd like to suggest, is part of the reason why this is included in the Ten Commandments. We're going to see this at the very end as well, in a statement by Abraham Joshua Heschel, sort of a more modern chassid of sorts. But basically what the Sefer Chinuch says is we have total freedom. Not just physical freedom, but we also have mental and moral freedom, which is one of the themes that sort of follow us throughout all these mitzvot. And so therefore, you might be able to argue that the 10th commandment, if it's really about moral freedom, you can control not only your actions, you can even control your thoughts, is parallel to the beginning, the first commandment, which says, I am the Lord your God that took you out of the land of Egypt. And it's basically saying, now that you are free, you have obligations to me, God. So too, this last commandment sort of bookends it. Actually, maybe we'll jump to Abraham Joshua Heschel now. It's the last source, number 7, on the last page, where he speaks about it in a slightly different way. Nothing is as hard to suppress as the will to be a slave to one's one pettiness. He's now talking about specifically the material items that one covets.
Are you on 3?
I'm sorry, now I move to number 7. Okay? Which basically picks up on what the Sefer Chinuch says, that we can control our thoughts, and he's now going to specifically relate it to the commandment of not to covet. Not to covet, which seems to be a material item, right? Not to want someone else's material items. But he says it's bigger than that. Nothing is as hard to suppress as the will to be a slave to one's own pettiness. Gallantly, ceaselessly, quietly, man must fight for inner liberty. Inner liberty depends on being exempt from the domination of things as well as from domination of people. There are many who have acquired a high degree of political and social liberty, but only very few who are enslaved to, but only very few are not enslaved to things. Meaning you can say you're totally free, but if you need whatever it is, you're still not really free. This is our constant problem. It's certainly a problem that's only become greater in the modern material world. How to live with people and remain free, how to live with things and remain independent. That you can have something, but you don't need it. You can have a phone, you can have a computer, but you don't need it at all. How do you have that freedom? In a moment of eternity, while the taste of redemption was still fresh to the former slaves, the people of Israel were given the 10 words, 10 commandments. It is in the beginning and end, the Decalogue deals with the liberty of man. The first word, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, reminds them of their outer liberty was given to them by God. And the 10th word, thou shalt not covet, reminds him that he himself must achieve inner liberty. In other words, you see the progress that the 10 Commandments is trying to encourage us to make. We start off with a gift from God. You are free. I've taken off the physical shackles. Now you have to develop your own personality, and therefore you engage in Shabbat, which is a time period where you're able to sort of think deeper thoughts, relate to your community, build up your own sort of relationship with God and others and the like. You then have honoring one's parents. You try to build a family life. All these specific mitzvot of not murdering and the like. You've developed your own sort of personality as a result of the freedom that God has given us. And the end goal is found in do not covet, which is you basically say, I'm free of everything. I'm not only free of physical constraints, but I'm also free of material want, or the feeling that I'm not enough of myself, which we're going to get to now in just a moment. Let me look at a couple of other ideas. We've spoken about coveting could be literally taking. We've spoken about coveting could be part of the plan, right? It's the planning stage of taking, and that leads to taking, so therefore it is kind of an action. We spoke about it as a form of thought. It's a thought, but a thought can be legislated against, says the Sefer Chinuch. You can control your thoughts in different ways. Now we'll see a few other ideas that relate to these three possibilities of the connected to actions. So if you look at number 4, Shnei Luchot Habrit. We must not ask how the Torah can expect us to exercise control over our mind's desires. This is a spurious argument. He agrees with the Sefer Chinuch. You can control your thoughts. How do you control your thoughts? He offers us a different idea. Sefer Chinuch says it's about creating habit, or potentially it's about just having sheer willpower. He says something different. Only wicked people or fools would argue in such a way. Man is a free agent and can control his desires. He can discipline himself not to desire what is forbidden. God is well aware of our innermost thoughts and will punish people for sinful thoughts. That's not mainstream, by the way, right? You are allowed to have sinful thoughts that you're not punished for, but the Sefer Shnei Luchot HaBrit is actually arguing that you are responsible. I think he's ultimately saying you're responsible because what it may lead to, not in and of itself having the thought. Whereas God will reward people who have pure thoughts. It is best for a person to train himself to have only pure thoughts as they lead to laudable deeds. You see, he emphasizes the deed is still the ultimate concern, the ultimate action. So that's a little bit connected to Sefer Chinuch. The Ibn Ezra, however, I think goes a step further. I just want to make sure that I'm hitting on certain things that I want to talk about. Okay. The Ibn Ezra, you shall not covet. He also thinks that we can control our thoughts, but he gives us a different piece of advice. Many people have wondered about this commandment. Is it conceivable that there should be a man who does not ever covet in his heart that which is beautiful? It seems natural that we should like something that is beautiful, that is positive. In fact, even in mitzvot, we speak about the concept of hidur mitzvah, right? We also speak about, when you talk about jealousy, kinat sofri. If someone is learning a lot of Torah, you want to covet their learning because it inspires you to want to have more. So either it has a positive element or it's simply a purely natural thing. So how do you control it? I will give you a parable to explain this. You should know that a villager who thinks rationally and sees the beautiful princess will not covet her in his heart. Right? You're this poor, very poor Jew living in this kingdom, and the king's princess, right? The king's daughter, the princess, is marching past in a huge processional. Does the poor pauper, Jewish pauper, say to himself, I wish I could marry that woman? No. It's so distant from who he is. It's so distant from his world. It's not part of the realm of possibility, so therefore he doesn't also long for it. And he certainly doesn't take action or create that mental plan that do not covet prohibits. He wants, but in a different way. In a different way. Meaning he's not, remember, coveting is that you're trying to figure a way out now to get it. Let me go, the parable actually, I think, gets stronger. Okay? The Ibn Ezra starts by saying, he knows this is impossible, and just the same, he will not serious. This is, I think, how the Ibn Ezra understands it. So maybe we have to create a new parable to just as the same as he will not seriously desire to have wings like a bird. So must every enlightened person know that a beautiful woman or money is not attained by a person because of his wisdom or knowledge. Rather, it is from which God has apportioned to him. There's two things that he says. One is the concept of impossibility. There's a beautiful teaching when it comes to Moshe, and he's asking to find the next leader. And the Torah says that Moshe understood all the people. And the Sfat Emet says as follows. He says, Moshe understood the diversity in people, and he did not get upset. One person has one opinion, another person has a different opinion. That's not reason to get upset, which, by the way, of course, today seems to be, part of the reason. If you think about civil society, we've broken down if someone disagrees with us. But it didn't bother Moshe. And Sfat Emet puts into the language, into the words of Moshe, it doesn't bother him any more than if people have different faces, right? If someone walks down the street and the person doesn't look like you, says the Sfat Emet, you don't get upset with them and say, how come you don't look exactly like me? You say, that's natural. That's part of the way the world is. So in the same way, if a person has a different opinion than you don't have to get furious at them. It's the way the world is. You don't get furious if they look differently than you. Why should you get furious if they think differently than you? So it's what you call impossibility. It's impossible that he's going to look like me. So the Ibn Ezra says something similar. He says, you don't miss not having wings. It's true, when I was a kid, I always wanted to fly. But I didn't make a plan to grow wings to fly, because it's not something that's rational to even think about. In the same way, you'd say, okay, you see that princess? You could think about her. You could think like it might be nice to fly, but that's it. It's a purely hypothetical that will never lead to something beyond that. And then the Ibn Ezra says, now take that to your neighbor's wife or your property. You should look at it the exact same way. It's a total impossibility. And once you say something is a total impossibility, it does remove it off the table. You know where this works very often is with vows, right? Sometimes you'll be tempted to want something, and then you'll make a vow, and instantly it's gone. There's a guy who wrote a book. There's a Yale law professor. He wrote a book called Stick K. Stick K is how do you stick to the commitments you make? And he says one of the ways you do so is you can't simply try, like he says, I want to go running every single day. Okay, you do it for 2 days and then something comes up and you don't do it. He says, how do you make sure you obligate yourself to do this or obligate yourself not to do something else? He says you have to make a verbal commitment. And he says you should even go a step further. You should write it to other people. You should let them know. That creates sort of a pressure. And what you really could do, and he has this website if you ever want to do it, he says you should give your credit card to a third party, and if you ever violate your commitment, the credit card automatically takes it off. So if you don't get up one day and jog, the credit card automatically will take something away. He actually goes a step further. I'll just tell you this one thing and then I'll call on you. He says you should actually do it to an anti-charity, something that you disagree with. Because sometimes if you're going to have the money go to a charity, you'll say, you know, if I eat this piece of chocolate cake, I automatically have to give 100 shekels to, you know, a charity that I believe in. You'll eat the cake, it's fine. But if you say, I'm going to eat this cake, I have to give the charity to, you know, God forbid, Hamas, you will not eat that cake. You've removed it as a possibility altogether. Anyway, he suggests this is one of the ways we structure our lives to make sure that we overcome our temptation. And he says that's what the nature of vows really are. When we make a vow, we basically use God to help us that we will not look at that item. We don't look at that item as permitted to us, right?
You don't get, but the problem with that is that assuming won't happen in your
Well, we are assuming because we're
Jews, definitely.
No, but the non-Jew would not necessarily make a vow, and that's why when he talks, this professor, he's not using the world of morality. He's using the world of just incentives. You know, the incentive is.
He's not talking about something
No.
very anti and give to that charity.
Oh, no.
Like Hamas.
No. So, but everyone's opposed to something. He says, for example, if you're pro-life, give your credit card. Actually, what he does is he has this program that he does with his college students to make sure that they get their papers in on time. And what they end up doing is they have to write to him every day how much they've progressed on a project. And if they don't write to him by 12 o'clock that night, he's already collected their credit cards in the beginning of the year, automatically, you know, the money comes out and it goes to something they disagree with. So for example, if all the students are pro-choice, automatically the money goes to a pro-life organization or something like that. And what happens is, he notices the students for sure always fulfill the obligation because they certainly don't want their money going to something that they disagree with tremendously. He doesn't talk about the concept of the vow. That's my connection. That's how I understand vows or shvuot in that regard, is that it basically takes something that's permitted to you, right? And it takes it off. Like, you know, why is it that if a person is dieting, they are tempted by, let's say, potato chips, but you're not tempted by lobster or pork? And now I'm talking about a Jew. Because the lobster or the pork is so off the radar, it's an impossibility. Physically it's possible, but given our upbringing and the like, it's almost as if it's not even food. The potato chip is still food. So you have to somehow transfer the impossibility of the lobster to the potato chip. So Judaism gives you that piece of advice with either a vow or something along those lines. That's what Ibn Ezra is trying to get to as well. He's saying you should look at that person's house, that person's ox. It's not even, it's like pork or lobster. It's not even a real ox. It's impossible. It's as if you had wings. Yes.
You mentioned the commitment of giving credit card.
Yeah.
What happens if I use the loophole and say bli neder?
I don't know if he accepts bli neder.
But what you're saying is by association, by using the pork to whatever it is that we're not supposed to covet, by association, it's actually very good.
How so?
Well, let's say this pauper
Yeah.
is coveting this princess, he's like truly,
Esther, right.
Right, not Esther,
Oh.
the Shiksa, what's her name?
Vashti.
Vashti, and he was who was he?
Yeah, yeah.
Nothing, he was a peasant.
Well, so that you read, okay,
So I'm
yeah.
saying by this association you're making is good, like, let's say there's something I cover.
Yes.
But I should really see in this pork or whatever, lobster, because I can't have that
Right.
thing.
So there's two ways of looking at it. One is, it's totally off limits, right? It's an impossibility. Or in the case you gave, for example, of Achashverosh, which was through drive, through ambition, he was able to accomplish that. So these are two slightly different things, and you have to make the distinction, right? This is a different opinion, we'll get to in a moment, that there are some things that you do want to covet, right? We spoke about Torah learning, for example. Well, because there, once you say that it's a good, and once you say that it is permitted to you, but almost impossible to accomplish, that's a different path than something that is bad that is not permitted to you. So you have to use the technique, you're right, sparingly and correctly, because sometimes you want to motivate, the young child to become a great Torah scholar. You don't want him to give up and say, oh, it's impossible, I'll never get to that. That's not true, and that's one of the reasons why it's important for every Jew who sees himself as royalty and the like. So you're right, there is this tension here. The other point that the Ibn Ezra makes that I think is important, and we're going to, again, sort of summarize a lot of these different points in just a moment, is he says, you shouldn't get upset if someone else has X and you don't, because you shouldn't think that the reason why he has X is because, he did something, and the reason why you don't is because you didn't do something. Everything we have, except as the Talmud says, Akol bidei shamayim chutz meyirat shamayim. Everything we have is from God, right? Except for our relationship with God. Our morality is our free will. But so therefore, if a person is a little bit more successful, a little bit less successful, obviously this is not universally accepted by all, but there is this idea that you're happy with what you have because it's a portion from God. Or alternatively, you're happy that someone else has what they have because it's a gift from God. You shouldn't feel bad that you don't have it. You have other things that you have. And that's where I want to see the next little bit. If Pirkei Avot, right? It's one of the lines that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. Number 6. Do not ask for glory for yourself and do not covet honor. Right? There's another example of coveting. More than just studying, you should act. And do not lust after the table of the kings. This lust is the same Hebrew language of do not desire in the second time the Ten Commandments appear. Since your table is greater than theirs and your crown is greater than theirs. Your employer is faithful, he will pay the wages of your labor. So we have both words, coveting and desiring, and we're told not to, and we're given reasons, right? One of the reasons is your table is greater than their table, right? So what are you lusting for? So in this case, of course, we're referring to sort of a non-Jewish king, and he has this great palace, and he has this great wealth, and he says, what are you lusting for that? What's really important in your life? Your table is more important. What's your table? So he's envisioning your table being a table of Torah, a table of family values, a table of relationship with God. That's much more valuable. So the first challenge in this Pirkei Avot is think about what's most important to you. Very often people are chasing things that they don't really want to impress people that they don't really care about. So when it says coveting that their neighbor just got a brand new car, is that even something that you want or that you need? Your table, right? Again, what your ideal table should be is more valuable than that in the first place. Let's look at some of the commentaries of how they understand this particular Pirkei Avot. So Rashi says as follows: on the words "V'al tachmod kavod," don't covet honor. L'tkabed b'toratecha, do not take honor in your Torah, right? Don't crown yourself with Torah. You should be humble with your Torah. Humility is, right, the prophet Micha says there's 3 things that we should do, right? We should walk humbly with our God is one of them. I should just mention as an aside, by the way, to walk humbly with our God. The Orchot Tzadikim says that, and this is actually related to everything we've said previously about the action of not to honor, not to covet. What does it mean to walk humbly with God? Obviously, if we were having a relationship with God and you're honest, me versus God, we're nothing. It's very natural to be humble in the face of God. So the Orchot Tzadikim says as follows. He says to walk humbly with God is in those areas where you have to be public. You have to make sure you do it discreetly and modestly. Specifically, when you celebrate a wedding and when you have a funeral. Because these are public mitzvot, is what he argues. What is he referring to? So there's another whole concept that we haven't spoken about that it's important just to maybe keep in the back of your mind. We've always spoken about lo tachmod, do not covet, coming from the point of view of the person who is coveting. But there's also another element of that. There's the person who might be causing someone to covet in the first place, right? There's a mitzvah of lifnei ivir. Don't cause someone else to sin. So if you get that fancy brand new car and showing it off to everyone, you might be sort of inspiring someone to covet. By the way, that may even be the reason why someone buys something, is to actually inspire jealousy, right? Or the reason why they are happy about a relationship with a certain person, to inspire jealousy. So that's another concern. In this mitzvah of lo tachmod, the action might be, from our point of view, not to inspire this type of jealousy. I was reading a book called The Geography of Bliss, and it's describing how the people in Switzerland, who are relatively speaking fairly wealthy, hide their wealth. That it's considered very inappropriate to show any signs of outward wealth. And in fact, if you show outward signs of wealth, it's very often thought that must be something is wrong, that you're going through a tough time, because no one would show their wealth. So the Orchot Tzadikim says, when do righteous Jews sometimes sort of show their wealth? He says, if you're doing something in your home, no one sees it. But you have to be public when it comes to a wedding and very often in a funeral. And he says, therefore, you have to be careful. Walk humbly with God means when you're doing mitzvot publicly, do them humbly, such as the wedding or the like. And if you think about this, if you look at the sources throughout our history, the rabbis have always been very sensitive to this. The Gemara in Moed Katan, for example, changes a number of traditions when it comes to burying the dead because of the problem of ostentatiousness. That it says that when a person would pass away, the wealthy would come with these gold platters to the Shiva house filled with food, and the poor would come with these wicker baskets. And because the poor were shamed as a result of the gold, the rabbi said, did away with that, you can only bring the wicker baskets. Also, in terms of the actual burial, it used to be that when wealthy people would pass away, there was a whole processional with, this big fancy bed, and there was gold and silver and the like. And the poor, of course, just took a very simple, bit. So what did the rabbis do to change that? So as not to inspire, right, the evil eye, ostentatiousness and the like. It says, bury a person in simplest, right, what we do in Israel, the shrouds, that's it. It shouldn't cost a lot of money at all. Part of that is to not inspire jealousy. Part of that also has a practical matter of not to encourage people to become covetous, which might encourage them. And now here's another practical effect. They then end up going into debt in order to keep up with the Joneses. This happens all the time. And in fact, if you look back, there's a number of decrees in the 1400s and the 1500s, the 1700s, and there was something even as recently as 1970, and the rabbis of B'nai Brak came out with this list of restrictions on weddings. In 1971, for example, the rabbis of B'nai Brak came to says you can only have first cousins at your wedding and very intimate friends. There's a fear that if you have so many people, right, it puts pressure on other people to want to do the same thing. They said you shouldn't have flowers on the table of the weddings. You should only have one main course, meat or fish, not both. Anyway, this was a whole list of things in the 1970s. The rabbis did it in every year. You can read through how the rabbis were very concerned about these big celebratory weddings or bar mitzvahs or vorts. And what happened is it created a pressure on the poor who couldn't afford it. They coveted it. They'd go into debt. And then, of course, that debt creates an incredible amount of stress and frustration and concern. In fact, I just read recently that there were 68 million Google searches for the words debt and suicide together. Right? Debt is one of these very powerful, very terrible, like pressures that people feel, and the rabbis were sensitive to that, and so therefore this is the flip side of do not covet. The flip side is do not cause someone to be covet. Walk with God humbly to make sure that that doesn't happen. Okay, I'm sorry. That was a little bit of a detour from Rashi. Lo tachmod kavod, don't desire honor, don't covet honor, especially in the honor of your Torah. It will appear that you're learning Torah for the wrong reasons. You should learn Torah simply the Shema, not because it's going to bring any benefit to you. Sheshulchancha, that your table is greater than their table. Hu schar shetikabel al limudo shel Torah. Your reward, your table, is a reward you get for Torah. It's your learning is what's important, and of course your deeds also, and the fulfillment of the mitzvahs. So make sure to remember what is actually important to you. When you do not covet, it is an affirmative statement of the values that are important to you. The Midrash Shmuel. Afshar lefaresh l'dayek milat la'atzmecha shehi miyuteret. When you read Pirkei Avot, it says, do not ask for glory, do not covet honor for yourself. That's an extra word, la'atzmecha. What? Run from glory, right? Yeah, you run from glory. Well, the Pirkei Avot is actually very adamant. It says, kavod, kina, jealousy takes us out of this world. There's a whole series of different problems and concerns with honor and right. You're supposed to run it, and it will chase after if you end up running away from it. But he says the emphasis on the word la'atzmecha, for yourself. He says it's okay to get honor for other people. He brings the case of, if we're talking about Purim, of Mordechai, who received all this glory, but he received this glory for the benefit of all of Am Yisrael. If that's your motivation, that's not a problem. The real problem in coveting is that it's a focus on your own selfish needs. If you want more for others, that's all right. If you want more for yourself, and so therefore the reason why this mitzvah, therefore, might be part of the Ten Commandments, and if you think about it for a moment, it might be connected on the second side, is because it's really a v'hafta l'recha kamocha. It's really about creating positive relationships with other people, because it's saying I shouldn't be looking just for my own needs. I should be looking for the needs of others, which therefore is an entire perspective on all the Ten Commandments. It, in a sense, is the fence around the Torah that the Rambam wanted. The way you don't murder, and the way you don't steal, and the way you don't do false testimony is by looking what are the needs of others as opposed to my own particular needs. The Kli Yakar focuses on the thing that which is being coveted, which has to do with money. But Tzipito ta zahav tahor. This is on Shmot, you can see, on that verse, about that they covered, they're talking about the tabernacle in pure gold. Rabbeinu Bechaya said, Remez mimilat zahav. He says, zahav is hinted at in Birkat HaMazon. How do we know? The Zion, this is from the bracha of Hazan et HaKol. The Hay in zahav, Hainu Birkat HaAretz. This comes from the mitzvah, the bracha, the second bracha. The bet, or the vet of zahav, Birkat Boneh, right? Yibanei Yerushalayim. So he says zahav is hinted at in Birkat HaMazon. And so every time you do Birkat HaMazon and you eat at your table, and you realize that the real gold is these brachot, is that God has provided your basic needs, that's what's really gold. And so therefore, you should be satisfied with what you have. The Kli Yakar lived in a very wealthy community, and he was always railing against the excesses of wealth. And he said, therefore, realize what you really need. Right? You can only eat a certain amount of food and be healthy. If you eat way too much, it's no longer healthy. And the parallel is if you buy way too much, if you acquire things way too much beyond your needs, that's also equally not healthy and just as dangerous. Rabbi Eliezer Hakapar Omer, this is what I mentioned to you previously. Akina, right? Jealousy and desire and kavod. Shalosh midot ra'ot, these three bad features, they motzi'im et adam mina olam, they remove a person from this world. they remove a person from this world as well as Olam Haba. And I think he goes on to say, Mashmot Zot, and he says, let me just give you an example. He says, this is parallel, Nira'im Veritzia, meaning a variation of, Al Divrei Rabbi Yoshua ben Chanina, Hamoneh Af Hu Shlosh Devarim Hamotzim Et Adam Min Olam, that Rabbi Yoshua ben Chanina says, there's three things that take you out of the world. A bad eye, the Yetzer Hara, and hatred of others. These three things are connected to jealousy, desire, and honor. The bad eye, higam hakina, that's jealousy. When you're jealous of someone else, you're looking at what someone else has. That's jealousy. In the success of the other, you're not happy with the success of the other. The desire, that when you have desire, he says something slightly different than what we said up to now. Desire is an emotion that clouds all your other emotions and rational thought. When you're overcome with desire, you have no supervision. Right? You're not able to supervise what's taking place. He says that's a Yetzer Hara. It basically clouds your ability to think. And he says that's why in number 416, do not desire to take someone else's thing. It's not the problem of seeing someone else's thing and, oh, that's nice, and maybe I would like to even get one of my own. But if you want theirs and you allow yourself to desire it, right, if you allow yourself emotionally to get involved with it, so that clouds your ability to then make the right decisions. And then he gives also the kavod, the person who chases after kavod. This creates hatred. Goes back to the Ben Adam L'Chaveiro idea. If you are thinking that you deserve more, that's really what's underlying coveting. I deserve this, right? That should be mine. So that creates a block in the relationship you have with other people. Just want to add two ideas about this. So one of the just on a very practical effect. I spoke a little bit about coveting and how it could potentially lead people to debt and the like. You see this actually all the time. We spoke about the cases of the individuals who leverage in order for a wedding, but you see it also in collapse of entire societies. Recently in America, right, you had people who were buying homes, second homes, third homes, who didn't need it, but because money was cheap, they ended up doing it without any awareness whatsoever, because they were jealous that everyone else was buying a house or this or that. And America collapsed, and there was a tremendous amount of wealth lost and real pain and agony. The same thing happened in other countries as well. In Spain, for example, people lost their jobs overnight because the entire economy collapsed. I actually just read something interesting, that debt has become so bad in Spain that the largest growing business is debt collection, and they came up with something fairly interesting of how to collect the debts. They realized that people are not paying their debts at all. The only thing that works is embarrassment. And so what they ended up doing is people now the debt collectors dress in tuxedos and top hats, and they go and they have on the side of their briefcase, and they knock very loudly at their apartments, and they make sure that everyone sees them, and they put down their briefcases that says, I am a debt collector, your neighbor has not paid such and such. And to embarrass, people look out their doors, and it embarrasses them. There's many different examples of this. One of the things they did, I'll just tell you one more thing that one of the things they did that was very interesting. One person did not pay for the wedding. Right? They had this lavish wedding. They didn't pay for it. The debt collector got the list of all the invitees and called 2 or 3 of them and said, we're suing you for, 60 euro or 100 euro or something like that. And then, why are you suing me that? They said, well, you ate chicken, from what we understand, and you had this amount of the hors d'oeuvres, so your host did not pay for it, so we're asking you to pay for the meal that you had. Anyway, they called 2 or 3 of the guests of the person. The next day, of course, the person who was hosting paid it right away because of the humiliation involved in debt. But people very often spend without realizing.
These are non-Jews.
Yeah, but people spend, but it happens. But that's there's a human nature. People spend without appreciating the actual cost, and that's what the Torah is trying to be very sensitive to about here as well. Is that coveting begins the process of not just tearing apart relations between people, but also tears you apart. The financial ruin can lead one thing to the next and then tears apart entire communities. It really becomes very, very, very powerful in this regard. The last idea that I want to talk about, which we mentioned briefly, but first you had a question.
No, I just had a collection. There was a company in England that carried over people who are Jewish people who smell very bad.
Yeah.
Go into the stores.
To
and say they're collecting smell.
Yeah. They've done a lot of different things. I mean, in Russia, I heard they sent actually a bear to collect money. It's become. I have no idea. I don't know. I just read it in a Wall Street Journal article about debt collection is a growth business in all parts of the world, and they're trying to find creative ways of doing so. The last thing is we've spoken about coveting as part of a process, and that's how it's an action because it's making a mental plan. We spoke about it as it could literally be taking. We spoke about it as the responsibility on the other person not to cause the idea. It's possible that coveting doesn't lead to anything vis-a-vis your relationship with the other person, right? We've always understood the problem of coveting, at least the Rambam, is that it will lead to then stealing. It will, meaning in a sense, this explains why coveting is the 10th commandment. Coveting makes all those other prohibitions more likely to happen. Once you begin to covet someone else's thing, you're more likely to steal it, you're more likely to kill in order to get to it, you're more likely to lie in order to get it. So that's why coveting is the 10th commandment. There's another way of understanding it completely, that it's not about what it does to other people, but rather it's simply against pure jealousy. Jealousy in itself, as we said, kina, takes you out of this world. You begin to act totally irrationally. I'll just end with this story. This happened in China not too long ago. There was a young man who was dating a woman for, I think, 3 or 4 months, and he breaks up with her and begins dating another woman. The first girlfriend begins to want the man back, and she calls him and says, can we meet? Anyway, all 3 of them meet on this bridge in China, and they're having a conversation. The old girlfriend wants the boy back. The new girlfriend wants to keep the relationship going. And the old girlfriend gets insulted, and she jumps off the bridge into the water, and she yells to her old boyfriend, save me, save me. The guy gets ready to jump in, and at that point in time, the new girlfriend is very jealous that her boyfriend is going to jump in and save the old girlfriend. So she jumps in as well and says, save me, you now have to choose, right? So they're both being pulled away in the river, and they're both yelling for the boyfriend to save. And I don't know if I was the boyfriend, I'm not sure I would do anything, but the boyfriend felt torn. He jumps in, and he in fact saves the new girlfriend. Right, exactly. It's a cautionary tale because it sounds absolutely crazy, but I'm sure in our own lives we all know the case of someone who became so enraged with jealousy that they just no longer were themselves, and that's really the issue. The issue is that when you're jealous, you're defining yourself not by your unique contribution to the world, but by someone else's contribution. The problem with jealousy is, one, you can never be satisfied, right? If a person in the Talmud says you want 100, you then want 200. 2, you're defining yourself vis-a-vis by what someone else has as opposed to your own unique contributions in the world. And 3, it makes you, literally crazy. You no longer are thinking rationally. That's the idea of the desire. You're no longer able to act in an appropriate fashion. And so therefore, even if it doesn't lead to anything else, you yourself are having this terrible effect is taking over your life. And so therefore it's almost like an issue of self-help. Do not covet is actually another freedom that God is giving you. That once you do not covet, you can actually then be free to be who you want to be, and you don't have to worry about that. I wanted to tell one other story that maybe I'll just say it very quickly, that plays a role in some of the things we said as well. There is a book, a play by Friedrich Dürrenmatt. It's a play called The Visit. And The Visit is the story of this very wealthy industrialist woman who returns to her small town after not being here for many years. And she promises to give $1 million, which in those days, is astronomical sum. The town is suffering and struggling. They're in debt. And she promises to give to the town, and the town is very grateful, and they're going to honor her and all these different things. She then reveals there's one condition. The one condition is that they have to kill this one person who's in the town, who's a popular individual in the town, and it turns out that this one individual, she used to be in love with him. They had a relationship with one another, and it ended very badly. And so in a sense, she leaves the town as a young girl. She makes this enormous fortune. She comes back and she's getting revenge on this one young man. And the townspeople reject the gift. They say there's no way whatsoever we can possibly accept this gift, which is going to cause us to kill this individual. But then you start seeing something interesting during the length of the play. Little by little, people begin to buy new outfits. Someone drives in a brand new car. The town mayor begins to do a construction project that he had put on hold for a long time. They're all basically going into debt, assuming that the debt they'll be taken out of course, once she gives the $1 million. In other words, all of them are publicly saying, we would never kill a person, but their actions are basically saying someone is going to make it possible that we're going to be able to collect this large sum of $1 million. And the play progresses and more money is spent that people don't have. And it ultimately leads, of course, the play ends with this individual being killed by everyone in the town. There are things that you think are impossible that you will ever do. But what Friedrich Dürrenmatt is suggesting, and I think the Do Not Covet as well, is that when the emotions take over and you begin to put yourself in debt or desire for something else that's not yours, that you can't have, you eventually will find a way to have it. It's a positive when it comes to something like Torah. It will inspire you to become the best you can be. But when it's these other things, it's the material items, if you become so emotionally attached that this is what you must have, you do not know where the process will end. And that's why it's the 10th commandment. It's basically the end of the road. If you allow this to happen, everything else you've just gone before that you've worked on and you've tried to perfect can also ultimately be destroyed. And have a good week.